Are you ready?
It's gonna be a hot girl disco summer. I'm never doing that again. I apologize. Why did I do that? Why did I do that? Here, let's fix it. Something cool. What is up, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy BDE, and I have spent 15 hours just studying this running back slate for you this upcoming week 6 slate. So we're going to cover every game. We're going to tell you who's a fantastic start, who's somebody that you got to definitely sit. We're going to tell you guys about our favorite betting props. We're going to tell you guys about some of these guys that are going to be smashes in DFS. As always, shout out to our sponsors, Drafters Fantasy. Use promo code DISCO to double your first deposit. Shout out to Better Vision, best app to sweat all of your drafts and your bets and your best ball and you name it and you got it. It's right there. And then also shout out to the guys over at Bull Rush. We really do appreciate you guys. And I partnered up with my guy Sleazebomb, aka Sleazeball, aka My Mind Is a Weapon Fantasy Football. And we got a fantastic Discord where we're helping over 150 beautiful fantasy football fans like yourself create not just a community, but also advise them to absolutely dominate and dummy their buddies in fantasy football. And we are crushing it. Our guys are crushing it. Nevertheless, let's get into the slate. Let's talk about game one, the first running back matchup with the start sets. And we're going to break down everything in a tier list. We're going to tell you guys who's a start, who's a sit, just like that. So the Philadelphia Eagles are 7.5-point favorites coming into New York on Thursday Night Football against Saquon's old team, the New York Football Giants. The Giants are 7.5-point dogs. The over-under is 40.5. And let's just get into the matchup and where it's advantageous. Philly versus the running back. So this is for Scam Scatabo. And yes, I said scam. Philly allows the 8th most fantasy points to RBs, and this is PPR format at 21.2, the 10th most rush yards at 97.60, the 11th most rush attempts, so a heck of a lot of rush attempts, 22.40, 9th most receiving yards allowed to running backs at 41, and the 4th most yards per reception at 9.76. Across the board, this is an advantageous matchup for Cam Scatabo, but it's even more advantageous for Saquon Barkley. Let's just hope he's healthy, because like if they were to practice yesterday, and yesterday is Monday, theoretically he wouldn't have been a participant just due to soreness, but he should still be good for the game. Right now he's questionable, but I mean the theoretical practice or not on a short turnaround week makes zero sense, and it just causes unnecessary panic. Nevertheless, the Giants defense should be panicking because Saquon Barkley is going to be elite. They allow the 7th most fantasy points to running backs, 22 PPR format. Everything I say is PPR format, so I'm going to stop saying that. 8th most rush yards at 108.60, 2nd most yards per rush attempt at 5.61, so almost a first, so more than a first down every 2 rush attempts, which is crazy, and tied for the 4th most rushing TDs per game. So across the board on the ground, it's a fantastic matchup for Saquon Barkley, and Saquon Barkley is S tier material. And Cam Scatable, I think you got to start him. If you haven't, you got to start him. And C's get degrees. It's good enough to just get by, and that's all right by me. So Cam Scatable is there. All right, let's look into game 2. We got another game in London, so make sure you guys are up and early and setting your alarms. We got the Denver Broncos coming off of a fantastic win against the Philadelphia Eagles, where they came back and they won. They are 7-point favorites against the winless, and I repeat, the winless New York Jets. Game kicks off at 9:30 a.m. Eastern time in London. The over-under is 43.5. So let's talk about it. The J.K. Dobbins here against what's his face? Brees Hall. All right, and we're gonna pull that looks so much better without the banner going across. Okay, so let's get into the matchup and what I like. So Denver is 19th when it comes to allowing fantasy points to opposing running backs, so it's not very advantageous for Brees Hall at all. They allow 17.6 fantasy points per game. They allow the 9th most yards per carry, though, at 4.57, 4th least rush attempts. So it means that teams have to air it out a heck of a lot against this team because they play stacked fronts. So they usually stack the boxes. 6th most receiving yards, which is incredibly advantageous, and the most yards per reception to opposing running backs. So Brees Hall's longest reception prop. Last week we said the longest reception, the receiving yards prop for Saquon was a lock. He hit them both in the same play. It was absolutely amazing. This week, we're going to say the same thing. We don't care what the longest reception prop is, and we don't care what the receiving yards prop is. It's an absolute lock for him to hit both of those. We love both of those. Now, J.K. Dobbins, on the other hand, he is no longer a joke. We're not saying just kidding anymore. That's his name. He's the real deal, and he was the real deal against a really, really good run defense last week against Philadelphia. And this week, he's not going against good run defense. He's going against a very bad run defense, which is fantastic for your fantasy football lineups. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to RBs at 21.1, the 7th most rush yards at 109, 3rd most rush attempts allowed per game at 25.4, and the 2nd least receiving yards. So it's not going to be advantageous in the receiving department, but they give up a lot of production on the ground. So J.K. Dobbins is going to be an A tier. And then once again, Breece Hall, C's get degrees, man. Hopefully he could break a long reception to the house like we saw our guy Saquon did last week, okay? But right now, it's just we haven't seen him put it all together, and he's had 2 of the best matchups. This is most certainly not one of the best matchups. All right, next game, we got the Cleveland Browns, who are 5-point dogs coming into Pittsburgh. The over-under is 38 points. And we got Quinshaw Judkins against Jalen Warren. It could potentially be Kenneth Gainwell. It could be Jalen Warren. Nevertheless, I don't like either one of them. So let's talk about the matchups, okay? So Cleveland, they are the 28th most advantageous. It's not even advantageous. They are ranked 28th when it comes to fantasy points per game. So it's not advantageous. I think it's like the 4th least advantageous matchup for running backs. They allow 13.5 fantasy points per game and the least rushing yards per game to opposing running backs at 62.40. So Jalen Warren, Kenneth Gainwell, don't love either one of them because there's no receiving upside, reception upside whatsoever as well. Pittsburgh versus the running back, on the other hand, a little bit more advantageous. They're 23rd when it comes to allowing fantasy points to opposing running back, 16.3 fantasy points allowed, 7th most rush attempts allowed at 23.75. Quinshaw Judkins is a volume monster, so the volume makes sense here. It's a perfect marriage. They allowed the 11th most rush yards per game at 95.25, the 8th most receiving yards at 41.5, and the 9th most yards per reception at 9.22 yards per reception to opposing running backs. So we don't hate the rushing yards prop for Quinshaw Judkins. We like that one a lot, and we don't hate the receiving yards either. So Judkins is in a B tier. He's better than C, a little worse than A because that offense is pathetic and anemic. And then Jalen Warren's borderline sittable, but if you don't have other options, so you're riddled with injuries, then you can't sit him. All right, next game, we got the Arizona Cardinals. They are 6.5-point dogs coming into Indianapolis. The over-under is 47.5. And Arizona gives up the 12th most fantasy points to running backs, 20.2 fantasy points per game, the 7th most targeted team to RBs when it comes to receiving game. They give up the 6th most receptions at 5.2, the 11th most receiving yards at 39.40, the 11th most yards per reception at 7.58. So across the board, we love every single prop here for Jonathan Taylor, but the low-hanging fruit in this game would most certainly be his receiving yards prop, and he has shown that he's a better receiver than not this year. So that's fantastic for you, especially in PPR leagues. Indiana on the Indianapolis, on the other hand, 24th most fantasy points, so not very advantageous. They give up 16 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. So it could be Michael Carter, could be DeMarcado. God, what an idiot! Just drop the ball. They're the 8th most targeted team, 6.4 targets, but nothing's really translated into fantasy production. So let's go to the next game. Let's talk about where they're at here. So Jonathan Taylor, no matter the situation, he's an S tier quarterback. Michael Carter, this is not the game you want to start him. I understand if you have injuries, try to start somebody else. He's in the D tier, okay? We got the Dallas Cowboys, and it's crazy because both these guys are in Cowboys jerseys. I couldn't find one with Rico Dowdle in the Carolina uniform for the headshot. So we got the Dallas Cowboys, who are 3.5-point favorites against the Carolina Panthers. And this is a fantastic matchup for both running backs, and we'll tell you why. Here's a tail of the tape. Dallas against running backs gives up the 5th most fantasy points to RBs. And we're saying Rico Dowdle, but if Chuba Hubbard's there, just switch him up because, like, Chuba Hubbard should still get the lean. As of now, we're going to go with Rico Dowdle because he is clearly the healthy guy, and he just came off of an RB1 production week. So Dallas gives up the 5th most fantasy points to running backs at 22.5. the 14th most rush yards per game at 91.40, third most receptions at 6.2, most receiving yards per game to opposing running backs at 59.80, and fifth most yards per reception at 9.65. Once again, guys, we're just laying out these stats for you. We did all the work so you guys don't have to. You guys just listen to that. You guys just look at that and you guys just apply it to your betting lines. Carolina versus running backs, not super advantageous. They've actually improved, but I feel like this is a trap, and Javonte Williams has been matchup proof. They've given up the 16th most PPR points to opposing running backs, 18.9, 16th most rush yards, 90.80, and 8th most yards per carry, 4.78. I like both of these guys in this game. Once again, they're both A-tier running backs for me, not quite S-tier yet, but the matchup's fantastic, and they've both been explosive. This is a great matchup for both running backs, and they're going to be very, very affordable in DFS, so I like both of them a lot. All right, let's talk about Game 6. We got the Los Angeles Chargers, and that's Kamani Vidal, but I'm going to give the lean to Hassan Haskins. I like Hassan Haskins a little bit more here. As we are recording this today, O'Marion Hampton is going to be on the IR, so minimum of the next 4 weeks he'll be out. So let's talk about where the Chargers are advantageous, and it's not an advantageous matchup whatsoever for Devon Achane and the Miami Dolphins on the ground. Even though we just saw Ja'Cory Cross-Merritt absolutely dominate, it's because just Ja'Cory Cross-Merritt has a legitimate and respectable offensive line. I wouldn't even say they're legitimate, but they're definitely respectable. And the Miami Dolphins offensive line is far from respectable. Coming off of like a league low performance where his rush yards, receptions, HN was very touchdown dependent this past week against a very advantageous matchup against the Carolina Panthers. He's going to be touchdown dependent here. Hopefully he gets a little bit more receiving volume. This is why we fell in love with him, but it looks like Darren Waller is stealing all that work. Nevertheless, 25th most fantasy points allowed to running backs is what the Chargers provide, 16 fantasy points per game, 11th most yards per attempt, 4.52. Not bad. On the other end, if it's Kamani Vidal, if it's Hassan Haskins, they have one of the best matchups in fantasy football. And if you're not owning one in DFS, you should definitely own the other. It's every DFS lineup should have one of these two guys in your lineup, whether it's Hassan Haskins or Kamani Vidal, because the Dolphins give up the fourth most fantasy points to opposing running backs, 24.5, the fifth most rush attempts at 24, second most rush yards per game at 133.60, third most yards per attempt at 5.57. So you are getting well over a first down for every 2 carries, seventh most receptions at 5.2, which is wild. You don't really have to throw against them if you're just successfully running the ball on first and second down. Fourth most receiving yards, 49.40, and the sixth most yards per reception at 9.50. Across the board, it's a fantastic matchup for Haskins and for Kamani Vidal. So Kamani Vidal is going to go into a C. I think Haskins would go up to a B, and HN's a must start every single week. It doesn't matter the matchup. Hopefully we see him get that reliable equity that we fell in love with when it comes to the reception aspect for Devon Achane. All right, next game. We got the Los Angeles Rams, who are only 7.5 point favorites. That's crazy. There are 7.5 point favorites against the Baltimore Ravens. As of today, there is no word that Lamar Jackson is back or not back. So we are just going to record this with the inclination that Lamar Jackson won't be back and in the lineup. So let's talk about the Rams. They are 30th when it comes to fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. They allow 13.3 on average. Yes, they just gave up a lot of production to CMC, but everybody will give up a lot of production to CMC. Here's him. They give up the 15th most rush attempts per game, so that's a bet. You could take the over on Derrick Henry's rush attempts if you're brave. Just the game script is going to be gross. 20.80. They give up 71.80 rush yards per game, so not advantageous whatsoever. And they've allowed 0 rushing TGs to it's bad. Baltimore, on the other hand, and when we're talking about Kyren Williams upside, Kyren Williams has RB1 upside just because the matchup is so advantageous. But I wouldn't be shocked if we see a little bit more quorum in this matchup because the game could get out of hand. But we also said that about the San Francisco 49ers game last week, and the Rams shat the bed. So, God, this game is so interesting, but also it's so ugly to project because, like, on paper, it should be spectacular across the board for all Rams. Nevertheless, Baltimore allows the second most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, 28.2. Shout out to Woody Marks. It was always Nick Chubb, I guess. So fantastic on the ground opportunity for Kyren Williams, who is one of the S-tier running backs on a weekly basis. They give up the fourth most rush attempts, 24.20, fifth most rush yards allowed per game at 117, seventh most rush yards per attempt, 4.83, tied for third most rush touchdowns allowed per game to opposing running backs at 1.2, fourth most receptions at 5.8, and the 10th most receiving yards at 40.20. Across the board, it's a fantastic matchup on paper for Kyren Williams. The game script is definitely going to be tough to project, but Kyren Williams goes into the S tier. Derrick Henry goes into the B tier because you cannot sit Derrick Henry. He is the king, and he is not dependent on game script, and he's not quarterback dependent. I anticipate that we'll see him bounce back, and hopefully this is the game that he bounces back because I just bought low for him pretty much everywhere. All right, next game. We got the New England Patriots and Ramondre Stevenson. They are 3.5-point favorites. My New England Patriots are 3.5-point favorites coming into the Big Easy, New Orleans. The over-under is 46 points. And Ramondre Stevenson put up like the quietest 2-touchdown performance when it comes to fantasy because he fumbled. He fumbled again. And it's like Antonio Gibson is no longer there to steal touches from Travion Henderson. So, I mean, this should be the boost for Travion Henderson that we want, that we need, that we've all been desiring. Prayers to Antonio Gibson, but it was never him. He shouldn't have been taking carries ahead of him. All right, New England versus the running backs. They've been very solid. They've allowed 27 fantasy points per game to opposing RBs. They just shut down James Cook, who has been dominating anybody and everybody and their mothers. They're the 14th. They give up the 14th most receiving yards, and historically, you know, if this was 2-3 years ago for Alvin Kamara, we'd be screaming that this is a fantastic matchup for Kamara, but the receiving usage just hasn't been there for Alvin Kamara under the Kellen Moore offense, even though they just came off of a win and a victory against the New York Giants. And they give up the 12th most yards per reception at 7.57. Nevertheless, I like Kamara. You always have to play Kamara. He's one of those guys where you have to play him if he's in your lineup. Now, New Orleans against running backs is quite advantageous. They give up the 11th most fantasy points to RBs in PPR format, 20.4, the 10th most rush attempts at 23, 13th most rush yards at 93.40, 8th most receptions per game at 5.20, and the 15th most receiving yards to opposing running backs. So across the board, it's a pretty decent matchup for Ramondre Stevenson. The only issue is we don't know if it's Ramondre or it's Travion Henderson. So Travion Henderson would go into the C tier along with Alvin Kamara. That's why we're putting Kamara. And then we're going to put Ramondre just because the coaches have this weird fucking crush on him in the B tier. And we're gonna stop cursing right now. We're done cursing. All right. Let's talk about the next game, game 9, I believe. We got the Seattle Seahawks versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Game kicks off in Jacksonville, and Jacksonville's coming off of a fantastic 14-point victory, comeback victory against the Kansas City Chiefs. The Seahawks are 1-point dogs actually coming into this game. The over-under is 46.5. And this game is going to be just like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Seattle Seahawks game that we just saw. I have this game predicted as like a definite shootout, and I'm very excited about it. So let's talk about what the Seahawks allow to opposing running backs. They're 14th when it comes to most advantageous matchup in terms of fantasy points per game PPR format. They allow 19.6 points per game. They also allow the most targets and receptions to opposing running backs. So this is a fantastic matchup. And fantastic for betting lines when it comes to Travis Etienne and Bashal Tutin. I like both of the receptions and receiving yards props. The Seahawks give up 7.2 receptions to opposing running backs on a weekly basis, and that is bound to continue. They allow the second most receiving yards at 58.40 and the 10th most yards per reception at 8.11. So across the board, it's very advantageous there on the ground for Travis Etienne. Now, Jags, on the other hand, they are 29th when it comes to fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. They're tied for second most targets per game, 7.75. So Kenneth Walker should be getting involved in the receiving game. And last week we said the same thing, and Zach Charbonnet just took all the work. It was very, very, very upsetting, but Kenneth Walker was very explosive on the ground, and he ran on the team that's unrunnable that's not a word, but we're making a word right now. Okay. They allow the 9th most receptions per game, 5, 5th most receiving yards per game, 47.5, 7th most yards per reception, 9.45. Kenneth Walker or Zach Charbonnet, longest reception is well in play and definitely something that we're considering. So we're going to put Travis Etienne in the A tier because he's been really good, and we're going to keep Kenneth Walker in the B tier. He should be in S tier, but the usage has been undesirable. It's just like Murphy's Law. What could go wrong has gone wrong. All right, next game, we got the Tennessee Titans. They just came off of their first victory. Shout out to the Cards. They are 4.5-point underdogs coming into Vegas. Vegas also getting absolutely blown out against the Indianapolis Colts. The over-under is 41.5. And this is another fantastic matchup for Ashton Genty, and we'll talk about it. Tennessee allows the second most standard fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and we'll talk about standard format. It just means there's a lot of touchdown equity. They allow 25.40 standard points, third most PPR points per game, 28 points there as well. Sixth most rush attempts per game to opposing running backs. This is what Tennessee allows, 23.80. Fourth most rush yards against, which is 122.60. Fifth most rush yards per attempt, 5.15, and most rush TDs allowed per game at well over 1.6. Vegas, on the other hand, 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs PPR format. We did say Tajay Spears come back, but he wasn't really in the mix as much as we'd like him to be historically. So this is still Tony Pollard's matchup, and I think if Tony Pollard balls out after this week, you sell high. He is startable for me. And they allow the second most rush TDs. They're tied for second most rush TDs, allowing 1.4. So when we're looking at the tier list here, Tony Pollard's going to be in the B tier because the matchup's just undeniable. And we're going to put Ashton Genty in the S tier where he belongs in this fantastic matchup because every running back eats against the Tennessee Titans and their atrocious run defense. All right, next game. Talking about running backs eating against an atrocious run defense, we got the Cincinnati Bengals, who are 14.5-point underdogs against the Green Bay Packers. And if you would have listened to me in the offseason, I would have told you Chase Brown is the biggest trap in round 2 of fantasy football. I argued with anybody and everybody. Nobody listened to me. But nevertheless, he's still a fantastic buy low option because after this week, the schedule kind of like lightened up a little bit. So let's talk about Cincinnati and why we love this matchup for Josh Jacobs and why Josh Jacobs is on the freaking thumbnail. They allow the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, 29.5, most rush attempts per game, 27, third most rush yards per game, 122.60, 10th most yards per attempt, 4.54, seventh most receiving yards per game, despite, which is 45, despite only letting 4.6 receptions, which is the 14th most, resulting in the third most yards per reception at 9.78, and they're almost averaging and allowing one rushing and one receiving touchdowns from opposing RBs every single week. So even the backup running back, and I don't even know his freaking name, but even the backup running back for the Green Bay Packers should eat theoretically in this game. Now, Green Bay, on the other hand, here's the only way it's advantageous for Chase Brown, and this is the only bet I'm taking on Chase Brown. When we're talking about the Green Bay Packers defense, they play a lot of bubble coverage, right? It's called shell, where they trust their pass rush. They let their pass rush get in and get early, get to the quarterback early. Why my words not wording? They allow the pass rushers to attack the quarterback, and because they're depending on the pass rush to get home so soon, that they leave a little vacancy in the flats and in the unders for some check down equity, right? But the check down equity doesn't necessarily translate into much. And the team is really good at rallying and tackling. Well, last time we seen them, they weren't very good at rallying and tackling against the Dallas Cowboys, but they're going to be very good at rallying and tackling here. Anyways, they're tied for second most targeted team to opposing running backs, second most receptions per game to opposing running backs at 6.5, and they give up the third least yards per reception. So when we're talking about Chase Brown here, the only thing I like about Chase Brown in this matchup is his receptions prop and the under across the board on everything else. So Josh Jacobs in the S tier. He's our RB2 on the week. And then we're just going to put Chase Brown in the D tier here, just close to being a sit. Very close to being a sit. We don't trust him. We don't love him. We don't like him. We told you guys not to draft him. You guys didn't listen. It's your fault, not mine. All right, next game. We got the San Francisco 49ers, who are 3-point underdogs coming into Tampa Bay. The over-under is 47.5, one of the higher implied point totals on the week. And let's talk about where it's advantageous, especially against San Francisco. And for Rachaad White, as of now, I'm anticipating Bucky Irving is still like a couple of weeks away from coming back because he has a labrum injury and he has a foot, toe, ankle situation. He's been in a walking boot. My mustache is going into my nostril. It's really, really, really irritating. Sorry, I swear I didn't do coke. Look at my nostrils. No coke here at all. All right, so San Francisco, 18th most fantasy points allowed per game to opposing running backs, 18.4, sixth most targeted defense. They allow 7 targets per game to opposing running backs, and they give up the 5th most receptions per game at 5.4. Across the board, it's very advantageous for every single receivings and receptions prop for Rachaad White. And he showed he doesn't care about the rushing defense, even if it's a good one, like Seattle last week. He's going to find the end zone. He's going to find it a couple times. So this is a fantastic situation for Rachaad White. And we just saw Kyron Williams go borderline nuclear against them without the not accounting for the fumbles. Tampa Bay, on the other hand, they allowed the 17th most fantasy points allowed, 18.8, third most receiving yards allowed, 51.4, and second most yards per reception. So at 12.24, so CMC's longest receptions definitely well in play, and all of his receptions, receiving yards, props are also in play in this matchup as well. I love that. And then we're just looking at the tiers here: CMC S tier, and we're going to put Rashad White in the B tier where he belongs because it's a fantastic matchup and he's a fantastic running back. And he was one of the best handcuffs in football. And we also said, I'm telling you, we also said, like, we loved Bucky Irving last year, but we're not paying the inflation on last year in this year's draft. So we told you guys not to draft Bucky Irving with that high draft capital. We told you guys to sell high. All right, with by far the highest implied point total on the week, we got the Detroit Lions against the Kansas City Chiefs, Sunday Night Football. The Lions are 2.5-point dogs coming into KC. The over-under is 52. 52 freaking Pointamundos. And I'm just going to say this. I love the receivers in this game, but you also got to love Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs is one of the best guys. So let's talk about where it's advantageous, okay? So Detroit, 26th versus RBs in fantasy points per game. Not very advantageous there. And Pacheco's been pathetical. 15, that's not a word, but it is now. They give 15.9 fantasy points per game, tied 10th most targeted team to RBs, 6 targets per game, and the 7th most receptions per game at 4.8. This is more of a Brashard Smith stat than a Isaiah Pacheco stat, but they got a 3-headed monster there, and I cannot recommend any of them because they all kind of suck at something, and they're all kind of decent at something, and we just haven't seen it come together except for Kareem Hunt stealing red zone work, like always, being the red zone vulture. The answer was always Kareem Hunt. KC versus RB, they are 22nd in fantasy points per game, 17.3, 10 in fantasy points per game standard format, though. So it's 22nd in fantasy points per game in PPR format, 17.3, 10th in fantasy points per game in standard format. Why? They give up the 12th most rush yards against. They allowed 94.50, 4th most yards per carry, 5.18, and 9th most targeted team to RBs, tied for 6th in receptions. And there's some touchdown equity where they allow an average of 1+ touchdowns to opposing running backs. So Jahmyr Gibbs always in the S tier. We love Jahmyr Gibbs. And Isaiah Pacheco's definitive sit. Like, don't play him. Don't play him. He's literally only sit there. All right, we got the Atlanta Falcons. And there's another one of those Mondays where we got 2 Monday Night Football games. And these are both really good games. Both games I really like. So the first Monday Night Football game that kicks off at 7:15 p.m. Eastern time. We got the Buffalo Bills, who are 3.5-point favorites. Over-under is 49. They're coming into Atlanta, and Buffalo is just coming off of a loss against my New England Patriots. Yay. And yay. Yeah. My Patriots beat them on Sunday Night Football. Yay. All right. Against the Atlanta Falcons, the Falcons are coming off of a bye week. So let's talk about where it's advantageous. So right away, Bijan is in the S tier, and James Cook is in the A tier. But James Cook's only in the A tier out of respect for what we love for him. When it comes to fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs, Atlanta in every format allows the 32nd most fantasy football production. So it's not advantageous whatsoever across the board. It was one of the least advantageous matchups on a weekly basis to opposing running backs. I'm not saying James Cook is a sit. Obviously, he's in the A tier, and he is a very explosive back. So hopefully he's able to break one free, okay? Now, Buffalo, on the other hand, they give up the 13th most points per game to opposing running backs, 20.0. The 9th most rush yards per game, 98.80. The 6th most yards per attempt at 4.99, and tied for third most TDs per game at 1.20, and the most targeted defense, tied for 9th most targeted defense at 6. Across the board, this is well within the Bijan Robinson profile. So, like we alluded to, Bijan Robinson S tier, he's our RB2 on the week. And yeah, James Cook is A tier. All right, next matchup, we got the Chicago Bears against the Washington Commanders. The Bears are 4.5-point dogs coming off of a bye week. The game kicks off at 8:15 p.m. Eastern time in Washington. The over-under is 50, the second highest implied point total. And Ja'Cory Crosby-Merritt is him. And if you guys listened to me in the offseason, early May, I said Ja'Cory Crosby-Merritt is this year's Bucky Irving, and he looked the part this past weekend. So let's talk about where this game is advantageous and stop victory lapping. No, I'm not going to stop victory lapping. I told you guys he was the best round 20 pick in best ball drafts. You guys didn't listen. And then you guys were like, oh, well, I'm not going to draft him in round 8. You should have drafted him in round 8. Stupid. All right, so Chicago, sixth most fantasy points per game on a weekly basis to opposing running backs. They're coming off of a bye. They allow 22 points per game to opposing running backs. The third most fantasy points in standard format. So standard format, we always try to look at standard format as well because the touchdown equity tells a story that this team is just bad at football and they're bad at defending certain scenarios. We do it across the board. So they give up the ninth most rush attempts per game, 22.25. So if you bet on rush attempts, we like JCM's rush attempts. The most rush yards allowed per game. So we love to parlay that with JCM's rushing yards. Hopefully the coaching staff loves that too at 140.75 yards allowed per game. And the most yards per attempt at 6.05. They almost give up a first down on first down. Make it make sense. It's terrible, terrible. You always want to start running backs against the Chicago Bears. He has to be an S tier running back this week. He has to, right? We'll see when we go to the final tier list. Washington versus running backs, though. So let's talk about DeAndre Swift. 21st most fantasy points per game allowed to running backs, 17.4. That's PPR format. 8th most rush attempts per game, 23.40. 12th most receiving yards per game. Well, that's well within DeAndre Swift's game, and that's where DeAndre Swift excels. They allow just over 30 receiving yards per game to opposing running backs. And the 8th most yards per reception at 9.45. Also well within DeAndre Swift's wheelhouse, so we like the over on his longest reception. So with that being said, DeAndre Swift is in the D tier. He is startable. He is serviceable, but we definitely don't love him. And then we're going to put Jacory Cross-Camara in the A tier because it's not a him problem because the matchup is an S tier matchup. It is not, I repeat, it is not a JCM problem. Not a JCM problem. This is a coaching problem. If he gets all the volume, he has RB1 upside this week. Every running back who goes against Chicago Bears has RB1 upside. It's the coaching. Do we see more Rodriguez? Do we see more McNichols? Hopefully the coaches don't fuck us in this situation. And I should stop cursing, but I'm not going to stop cursing. I appreciate you guys. Thank you for rocking with me. We are going to record our wide receivers video shortly. And then tomorrow we're going to post our quarterbacks and our tight end videos. So stay tuned. Turn that bell notification on. Subscribe if you haven't. Sign up on Drafters Fantasy Sports to tell all of our delicious props that we're going to be posting here on X, here on YouTube, on X, across the board. We're going to be posting everywhere. If you guys want to take your fantasy football league to the not just your league, just your fantasy football lineups to the next level, join the greatest fantasy football community, the Guys FF, where I partner up with my guy Sleazebomb. And yeah, turn those bell notifications on. Thank you guys so much for 2K subscribers. Catch us live Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern time before kickoff. Saturday, we're going to go through every game on the slate, talk about all of our favorite props. We are shooting over 76% on our props right now. So time for the best outro in fantasy football. Peace.